Leonard Gray knelt at the execution block not because he lost a battle, but because he won way too convincingly. He was the only man who tamed the chaos of Ireland, yet his own cousin Henry VIII dragged him home and chopped his head off with the ridiculous excuse of colluding with the enemy. It is a chillingly irrational death, a king murdering his best general just to please the very enemies he defeated, turning a brilliant victory into a death warrant signed by a relative. In Henry VIII's eyes, Gray wasn't a hero anymore. He was just a diplomatic item to be traded. The jealous, aging king cold-heartedly sold out his most trusted man, using Gray's head as a gift to calm down the angry Irish clans. This story strips naked the raw truth of power. When you are so competent that you actually scare the king, even absolute loyalty cannot save you from the axe. Leonard was born into the upper stratosphere of English nobility, likely between 1479 and 1492. His mother was Cecily Bonville, one of the wealthiest heiresses in the land. But it was his grandmother who mattered most, Elizabeth Woodville, the White Queen, the wife of Edward IV. This meant Leonard Gray was a first cousin to King Henry VIII. For the first half of his life, this blood was an asset. He walked the halls of power not just as a servant, but as kin. He held the position of carver to the king. In a modern context, this sounds like a waiter. In the 1500s, it was a security clearance. You didn't let anyone carve your meat unless you trusted them with your life. It implies an intimacy, a physical closeness to the monarch that few ever achieved. But there was a fatal flaw in the Gray family web. Leonard's sister, Elizabeth Gray, had been married off to the Earl of Kildare, Gerald Fitzgerald. The Fitzgeralds were the uncrowned kings of Ireland. They ruled the territory with an iron fist, often ignoring London's orders. This marriage created a paradox that would haunt Leonard forever. He was the English king's cousin, but he was also the uncle of the Irish rebels. When the Fitzgerald family eventually rose up against England, the man sent to destroy them was their own flesh and blood. Henry VIII loved this kind of twisted loyalty test. He wasn't just sending a general. He was sending a message. He was forcing Gray to choose between his king and his kin. By 1535, Ireland was on fire. The Silken Thomases Rebellion had broken out. Thomas Fitzgerald, Leonard's own nephew, had publicly renounced allegiance to Henry VIII. The English control over Ireland, limited to a small area known as the Pale around Dublin, was collapsing. Previous viceroys had failed. They were too slow, too old, or too scared of the Irish terrain. Henry needed a hammer. He sent Leonard Gray. Gray arrived not as a diplomat, but as a marshal. He looked at the situation and realized that the old ways of medieval siege warfare were useless against the fortified Irish tower houses. He needed to change the game. This is the moment military history in Ireland changed forever. Gray marched on Maynooth Castle, the stronghold of the rebels. It was considered impregnable. The walls were thick, the defenders were well stocked, and they expected a long, drawn-out siege that would end in a negotiated truce. Gray didn't bring ladders. He brought siege guns and heavy artillery. For days he bombarded the castle. The defenders had never seen anything like it. The walls didn't just chip, they shattered. When the breach was made, the English troops stormed in. The garrison, realizing the castle was lost, surrendered. They expected the standard rules of war. You fight, you lose, you surrender, you pay a ransom or pledge loyalty, and you live. Gray had other ideas. He accepted their surrender, gathered the survivors, between 37 and 50 men, and then ordered their immediate execution. They were hanged and beheaded before the smoke had even cleared. This became known as the Maynooth Pardon. It was a dark joke, A terrifying euphemism. It meant surrender and die. Strategically, it was brilliant. It sent a shockwave of terror through the rebellion. Silken Thomas, seeing his impenetrable fortress cracked like an egg and his men slaughtered, lost his nerve. He surrendered a few months later in August 1535. Grey had won. He had done what no one else could do, but in doing so, he had stained his soul. He had proven he could be ruthless, even dishonorable, to serve his king. If Maynooth was a tactical atrocity, what happened next was a descent into pure brutality. Grey wasn't just fighting an army, he was trying to break a culture. In 1536, he turned his sights on Carrigogunnow Castle in the Thomond region. The castle fell. The details of what happened next come from Grey's own reports. He didn't hide it, he boasted about it. He wrote to London that he had taken the castle and put everyone inside to the sword. The chilling part is the specificity. He noted that the dead included women and children. In the 21st century, we read this as a war crime. In the 16th century, Grey framed this as virtuous service. He was trying to prove to Henry VIII, a distant, demanding master, that he wasn't soft. He knew the king suspected him because of his family ties to the rebels. So Grey overcompensated. He became a butcher to prove he wasn't a traitor. He was appointed Lord Deputy of Ireland in 1536. He was now the highest authority in the land. He was created Viscount Grain. He was at the pinnacle of his career. In 1539, at the Battle of Bellahoe, he led a daring night raid against the combined forces of the northern chieftains, O'Neill and O'Donnell. It was a decisive victory that saved the Pale from invasion. He forced the Irish Parliament to pass the Act of Supremacy, making Henry the head of the church in Ireland. He was the perfect servant. He was winning battles, passing laws, and crushing dissent. But in the shark tank of Tudor politics, success doesn't protect you. It just attracts more sharks. Why does a man who wins everything end up losing his head? The answer lies in money and paranoia. Henry VIII wanted Ireland conquered, but he didn't want to pay for it. The English crown was notoriously tight-fisted with the Irish administration. Grey had an army to feed, fortifications to build, and almost zero budget from London. With no coin coming from England, Grey had to resort to an ancient, hated Irish custom called coin and livery. Essentially, this allowed the military to requisition food and lodging from the local population for free. It was extortion. The locals hated it. The nobility of the Pale hated it. But Grey had no choice. If he didn't feed his men, they would mutiny. This was the opening his enemies were waiting for. The Butler family, the Earls of Ormond, were the historic rivals of the Fitzgeralds. They despised Grey because of his connection to their enemies. They began a whispering campaign in London. They told the king that Grey was letting his soldiers run wild. They claimed he was harassing the king's subjects. Henry VIII, in a display of supreme hypocrisy, used this against Grey. The king, who refused to send money, now accused his general of theft for trying to feed the army. Grey was caught in a classic double bind. If he didn't use coin and livery, the army would collapse. If he did use it, he was abusing the king's subjects. By 1540, Henry's mood had shifted. The king was getting old. He was tired of the constant, expensive wars in Ireland. He decided to change tactics. Instead of conquest, he wanted a policy of surrender and regrant, bribing the Irish chieftains to become English subjects. But there was a problem. The Irish chieftains didn't trust England. Why? Because of Leonard Grey. He was the man of the Maynooth pardon. He was the butcher of Carrigogunnow. You cannot send a butcher to shake hands. To make peace with the Irish, Henry needed to show he had changed. He needed to blame the past violence on a rogue agent. Grey became the perfect scapegoat. Henry could execute him and say to the Irish lords, "Look, I have punished the man who was cruel to you. Now let us be friends." In June 1540, Grey was recalled to London. He probably thought he was coming home to be honored or perhaps reprimanded and retired. Instead, he was thrown into the Tower of London. The Crown drafted an indictment with over 90 separate counts of treason. When you look at these charges today, they read like a desperate attempt to throw everything at the wall to see what sticks. The most damaging charge involved the young Gerald Fitzgerald. After the rebellion, the 12-year-old heir to the Kildare earldom had gone into hiding. In 1539, the boy was smuggled out of Ireland to France. The prosecution claimed Grey had turned a blind eye, allowing his nephew to escape because of their blood connection. The reality was that the boy was protected by a massive underground network of Irish loyalists. Grey had hunted him relentlessly, but facts didn't matter. The narrative was that Grey put family above king. During a campaign through a swampy region, Grey's horses died, and the mud was waist deep. He was forced to leave some artillery pieces behind to save his men. The charge was that he deliberately armed the rebels by leaving weapons for them. They accused him of falling in fury. Witnesses claimed that during council meetings, Grey would scream, curse, and even rest his hand on his dagger while threatening other officials. Was this true? Probably. Grey was a soldier surrounded by politicians he didn't trust, under immense stress and receiving no support from home. He was likely suffering from what we would now call combat stress, but in court, this was painted as the behavior of a man plotting to seize power. Henry VIII's paranoia filled in the blanks. He began to fear that Grey, with his royal blood and his military control over Ireland, was planning to set himself up as a rival king. The trap was set, but it would not spring immediately. For 3 agonizing years, Leonard Grey would be forced to walk a path where every step forward was a step toward his own grave. As the smoke of Maynooth settled into the soil, a new reality emerged. The battlefield was no longer the primary danger. The true war was moving from the castle walls to the council chamber, where the weapons were not cannons, but whispers. And at the heart of this new conflict was not a soldier, but a ghost, a child who had slipped through Grey's fingers and who now carried the weight of an entire nation's hope. In the aftermath of the Maynooth slaughter, the smoke cleared to reveal a landscape that was physically conquered, but politically poisonous. We left Lord Leonard Grey in 1536, standing atop the ruins of the rebellion, newly appointed as the Lord Deputy of Ireland. On paper, he was the master of the island. In reality, he was a prisoner of his own success. The years between 1536 and 1539 are often glossed over in standard textbooks as a period of administrative difficulty. But for those living through it, it was a psychological thriller played out in the mud of the Pale and the gilded chambers of Whitehall. To understand the tragedy of Leonard Grey, we must understand the impossible trap of the Geraldine League. It is here that the personal and the political collided with fatal force. The ghost of the rebellion was not dead. It had merely taken the form of a 12-year-old boy. The execution of Silken Thomas and his 5 uncles had been meant to wipe the house of Kildare from the face of the earth. Henry VIII wanted a blank slate, but there was a survivor. Gerald Fitzgerald, the half-brother of Silken Thomas and the nephew of Leonard Grey, was only 12 years old. He was the heir to the earldom, the last hope of the ancient Fitzgerald dynasty. To the Irish, he was a messianic figure. To Henry VIII, he was a loose thread that needed to be cut. This boy became the center of a game of cat and mouse that spanned the entire island. A vast, invisible network of Irish loyalists formed to protect him. They smuggled him from castle to castle, hiding him in the glens of Wicklow and the wilds of Donegal. This coalition became known as the Geraldine League. And who was the man charged with hunting down this child? It was his own uncle, Leonard Grey. Consider the agony of this position. Every time Grey marched his army to capture the boy, he failed. Was it bad luck? Was it the terrain? Or was it, as his enemies whispered, hesitation? The Butler faction, the Earls of Ormond, watched Grey with hawk-like intensity. Every time Grey just missed capturing the boy, the Butlers sent a letter to London. "The Lord Deputy is soft," they wrote. "He spares the traitor because of the blood they share." Historical evidence suggests Grey was actually trying his best to capture the boy. He campaigned relentlessly. He threatened the chiefs who harbored him, but the optics were damning. In the Tudor court, perception was reality. Grey could not prove a negative. He could not prove that he wasn't letting the boy escape. While the hunt for the boy drained Grey's spirit, the hunt for money drained his authority. This is where the story shifts from a war drama to a bureaucratic tragedy. Henry VIII expected Ireland to pay for itself. He sent Grey almost no money to pay the troops. A standing army in the 16th century was a voracious beast. Without pay, soldiers turned into bandits. They looted the countryside, stole cattle, and alienated the very people Grey was trying to govern. To keep his army from mutiny, Grey was forced to rely on coin and livery. This was an ancient Irish custom, effectively a tax of food and lodging levied directly on the local population by the military. It was despised by the English legal system and hated by the colonial settlers of the Pale. It was illegal, yet it was necessary. The council in Dublin, dominated by the Butler faction and old administrative families, refused to sanction it. They blocked Grey's requests for funds, then criticized him when he used coin and livery to survive. Grey was caught in a classic double bind. If he disbanded the army, the Irish would invade, and he would be executed for incompetence. If he maintained the army using coin and livery, he was breaking the law and could be executed for tyranny. The stress began to fracture his mind. Reports from the Irish Council describe a man on the edge of a breakdown. During meetings, Grey would fly into terrifying rages. He would scream at the Archbishop of Dublin, calling him a pole-shorn knave. He threatened to cut off the heads of councillors who disagreed with him. We must act as empathetic historians here. Was this merely a bad temper? Or was this the behavior of a soldier suffering from chronic combat fatigue, isolated in a hostile country, knowing that the men sitting across the table were writing letters to the king detailing his demise? By 1539, the situation was critical. The Geraldine League had become a military reality. The great northern chieftains, O'Neill and O'Donnell, united their forces, a rare occurrence in Irish history. They marched south, invading the Pale, burning towns and threatening Dublin itself. This was the moment the Butlers had warned of. They claimed Grey's policies had failed. They waited for the collapse. Instead, Leonard Grey reminded everyone why he was the marshal. He rallied the tired, unpaid army. He shamed the local gentry into joining him. He marched north with a speed that caught the Irish Confederation off guard. At Bellahoe, on the border of Monaghan and Meath, the two armies met. It was late in the day, perhaps near dusk. The Irish forces were laden with booty, retreating back to the safety of the north. They were on the far side of a river, confident that the English would not attack across the water at night. Grey did not hesitate. He ordered the attack. The Battle of Bellahoe was a chaotic, brutal affair fought in the fading light and the river mud. The English cavalry and the Dublin militia smashed into the Irish rearguard. The O'Neill and O'Donnell forces broke. It was a rout. Bellahoe was arguably the most significant English victory in Ireland in decades. It shattered the power of the Geraldine League. It saved the Pale from destruction. It proved that English arms could defeat the united might of the Gaelic North. Grey returned to Dublin as a conqueror. He was knighted on the field or knighted others, exercising viceregal power. For a brief moment, he was the hero. But in the twisted logic of Henry VIII's reign, a victory could be as dangerous as a defeat. By crushing the external threat, Grey removed the immediate danger that made him indispensable. The king no longer needed a warrior. He now needed a scapegoat for the years of chaos. The end did not come with a bang, but with a letter. Throughout 1540, the whispers in London grew into a roar. The butlers, led by the astute and venomous Piers Butler, Earl of Ormond, had constructed a dossier against Grey. They accused him of everything: corruption, tyranny, nepotism, and, most dangerously, secret Catholicism, papist sympathies. The king was tired. He was aging, his leg was ulcerated, and his treasury was hemorrhaging money. He wanted a new policy for Ireland. He wanted surrender and re-grant, a diplomatic approach where Irish chiefs would swap their Gaelic titles for English ones. Leonard Grey, the man of blood and iron, the man of the Maynooth pardon, was the wrong tool for this new era. You cannot ask a chieftain to shake the hand that butchered his kinsman. In the spring of 1540, the summons arrived. Grey was ordered to return to London to consult with the king. It is haunting to speculate on what Grey thought as he boarded the ship at Dublin. Did he believe his victory at Bellahoe would save him? Did he trust in his royal blood? Or did he look at the gray waters of the Irish Sea and realize he was sailing toward his grave? He left behind his sword, his army, and the country he had broken. He brought with him only his record of service. He arrived in London in June. He was not taken to Hampton Court to feast with his cousin the king. He was arrested and taken immediately to the Tower of London. The silence of the tower was deafening, but the machinery of the state was deafeningly loud. While Grey sat in the damp dark, the lawyers of the crown were drafting a narrative that would rewrite his life's work. They were preparing a theater of justice where the verdict was written before the accused even entered the room. The soldier who had survived the bogs of Ireland and the fury of the Geraldines was about to face the one enemy he could not outmaneuver: the law of a king who needed a sacrifice. We resume our narrative in the summer of 1541. Lord Leonard Grey is no longer the marshal of the army or the terror of the Irish rebels. He is a prisoner in the Tower of London, stripped of his furs, his command, and his dignity. When a peer of the realm, a lord, was accused of treason, he was entitled to be tried by the House of Lords. He was to be judged by his equals. But Henry VIII's lawyers found a technicality to humiliate Grey before the trial even began. Leonard Grey was a Viscount, yes, but his title, Viscount Grain, was part of the Irish peerage. In England, the lawyers argued he was legally a commoner. Therefore, he would not be judged by the lords. He would be judged by a jury of knights and common gentlemen. This was a calculated insult. It stripped him of his status and signaled to the court that the king did not view this man as family. He was just another subject to be processed. On June 25, 1541, Grey was brought to Westminster Hall. The Great Hall was the theater of English justice, a cavernous space where the air was always cold and the smell of fear was palpable. Grey initially stood tall. He entered a plea of not guilty. He was prepared to fight. He knew the charges were fabricated. He knew that the artillery he left for the rebels was actually abandoned because of mud. He knew that the boy he let escape was protected by a network he couldn't penetrate. He had his arguments ready, but the crown had a weapon sharper than any axe, the threat of attainder. In Tudor treason trials, the conviction rate was nearly 100%. If Grey fought the charges and lost, which was inevitable, he would face the full penalty of high treason. This meant being drawn and quartered, a horrific death. But worse, it meant corruption of blood. Corruption of blood was a legal concept that meant the traitor was legally dead to his ancestors and his descendants. His property would be confiscated by the crown. His wife would be left penniless on the street. His children would inherit nothing, not a title, not a house, not a spoon. Their lives would be destroyed. However, the crown offered a whisper of hope. If Grey confessed, if he saved the king, the embarrassment of a long trial, perhaps the king would be merciful. Not merciful to Grey's body, perhaps, but mercy for his estate. If he pleaded guilty, perhaps his family would be allowed to keep their home. This was the torture of Henry VIII. He forced men to choose between their honor and their children. Sometime during the proceedings, Leonard Grey broke. He saw the jury. He saw the judges. He realized there was no way out. He withdrew his plea of not guilty. He stood before the court and confessed to the indictment. He admitted to being a traitor. He admitted to sins he had never committed. He swallowed the lies to save his family from destitution. He was sentenced to death. On July 28, 1541, on Tower Hill, the execution of a high-profile traitor was a public spectacle. But by 1541, the London crowds were suffering from fatigue. They had seen so many heads roll: Thomas More, Anne Boleyn, Thomas Cromwell, the Marquis of Exeter. Leonard Grey walked out of the Tower gates. He was not dragged. He walked. The accounts describe his demeanor as quiet and godly. This is a stark contrast to the man who had screamed at his counselors in Dublin, the man who had ordered the massacre at Maynooth. The fire had gone out. In its place was a resignation, a final acceptance of the rules of the game he had lost. He did not use his final speech to rail against the injustice. To do so would have endangered the deal he made for his family. He likely followed the standard script, asking the king for forgiveness, acknowledging that he deserved to die legally, and asking the crowd to pray for him. He knelt at the block. The executioner did his work. It was a clean death for a man whose life had been messy. His body was carted back into the Tower complex and buried in the chapel of St. Peter at Vincula. He lies there today under the flagstones, mixed with the dust of queens and saints, a cousin who served the king too well. The supreme irony of Leonard Grey's death revealed itself less than a year later. For centuries, English monarchs had held the title Lord of Ireland. It was a feudal title, suggesting that the Pope was the ultimate owner of the island. But Henry VIII had broken with the Pope. He needed a new title to assert his absolute sovereignty. In June 1542, the Irish Parliament passed the Crown of Ireland Act. Henry VIII was proclaimed King of Ireland. This was a monumental constitutional shift. It was the first time there was a Kingdom of Ireland united under the English crown, and Henry could only do this because of Leonard Grey. It was Grey who had smashed the power of the Kildare Rebellion. It was Grey who had terrified the chieftains with his artillery. It was Grey who had marched into the forbidden territories of the West and North, proving that the English arm could reach anywhere. Henry VIII placed the crown of Ireland on his head, standing on a platform built by the cousin he had just beheaded. The king took the credit, the general took the blame. But what of the boy? What of Gerald Fitzgerald, the 12-year-old nephew whose escape had cost Grey his life? The execution of Leonard Grey did not stop the boy. In fact, it removed the only man capable of catching him. With Grey dead and the English administration in chaos, the Geraldine League succeeded. They smuggled young Gerald out of Ireland. He traveled to France, then to the Holy Roman Empire, and finally to Italy, where he was protected by the enemies of Henry VIII. He grew up in exile, educated in the courts of Renaissance Europe, a living symbol of Irish resistance. He outlived Henry VIII. He outlived Henry's son, Edward VI. In 1554, under the reign of Queen Mary I, who was Catholic and sympathetic to the old families, Gerald Fitzgerald returned to England. He was restored to his titles. He became the 11th Earl of Kildare. The House of Kildare rose from the ashes. The dynasty that Leonard Grey was sent to destroy survived. Leonard Grey's tragic arc was complete. He had served as the hammer of the Tudors, crushing the Silken Thomas Rebellion and staining his soul at Maynooth, only to be discarded when the political winds shifted. He had conquered the land for a king who killed him, proving that in Henry's court, success was no shield against paranoia. The axe on Tower Hill had silenced the general, but the chaos of Ireland screamed on. With the military solution now buried alongside Grey's headless corpse, the crown pivoted violently. If blood and iron had failed, perhaps ink and parchment would succeed. But as the king's new agents sailed for Dublin, they carried with them a dangerous illusion, the belief that a few signatures could erase centuries of defiance. They were about to learn that peace bought with gold is often more fragile than peace bought with steel. The man sent to replace the butcher Grey was a man named Anthony St. Leger. He was smooth, sophisticated, and cunning. He came to Ireland not to break the chieftains, but to buy them. Anthony St. Leger arrived in Dublin with a clear mandate: do the opposite of Leonard Grey. Where Grey was a soldier who slept in his armor, St. Leger was a courtier who understood the power of a well-placed bribe. He looked at the Irish landscape and realized that the unending wars were bankrupting the crown. The English could not afford to conquer Ireland mile by mile. His solution was genius in its cynicism. He proposed a massive legal fiction. The Gaelic chieftains, the O'Neills, the O'Donnells, the O'Briens, held their lands by ancient tribal right. They were captains of their nations, elected by their clans. St. Leger offered them a deal. Surrender your lands to King Henry. Acknowledge him as your liege lord. In return, he will immediately regrant the lands back to you. But this time, you will hold them not as a tribal chief, but as an English earl. It was a seduction. To a weary Irish warlord, constantly looking over his shoulder for a rival claimant within his own family, an English title offered security. Under English law, your son inherited your land. Under Irish law, your land was up for grabs when you died. St. Leger wasn't using artillery to knock down castle walls. He was using English property law to dismantle the Gaelic social structure from the inside. The climax of this new policy was the Parliament of June 1541, held in Dublin just weeks before Leonard Grey was executed in London. It was a spectacle designed to erase the memory of the Maynooth pardon. For the first time in history, the Old English settlers of the Pale sat alongside the wild Irish chieftains. The Earl of Desmond, a man who had been a rebel for decades, attended. The representatives of the great O'Neill were there. The Speaker of the Commons gave a speech praising Henry VIII. The bill declaring Henry King of Ireland was read aloud. And then a moment of profound symbolism occurred. The bill was read in English, then it was read in Irish. The assembled lords, many of whom did not speak English, cheered. They tossed their caps in the air. The wild Irish and the civilized English embraced. St. Leger wrote to Henry VIII that it was a miracle. But while the champagne, or wine, flowed in Dublin, Leonard Grey sat in his cell in the Tower, awaiting death. He was the scapegoat who made this moment possible. The Irish lords were willing to kneel to Saint Leger only because they were terrified of another Grey. The peace of 1541 was built on a foundation of terror. The chieftains smiled at Saint Leger, but they watched his hands to see if he too held a dagger. If Leonard Grey's downfall was a tragedy, the fall of his enemies, the Butlers, was a mystery novel. The Butlers, the Earls of Ormond, had engineered Grey's destruction. They were the winners. With Grey dead and the Fitzgeralds in exile, the Butlers were the undisputed power brokers of Ireland. Piers Butler and his son James controlled the South. They were rich, connected, and untouchable. But in the Tudor court, being untouchable just makes you a better target. St. Leger, the new Lord Deputy, began to clash with the Butlers. It was the same old song, the Viceroy in Dublin versus the great Anglo-Irish magnates. The Butlers felt St. Leger was too lenient with the new Irish earls. St. Leger felt the Butlers were acting like petty kings, ignoring the crown's laws. The feud became bitter. In 1546, James Butler, the 9th Earl of Ormond, was summoned to London. He went to dine at Ely House in Holborn. It was a diplomatic dinner, attended by his entire retinue. That night after the meal, the Earl and 35 of his servants fell violently ill. 17 of them died, including the Earl of Ormond. It was a massacre by poison. London was scandalized. Who would dare wipe out the most powerful family in Ireland in the middle of London? Rumors swirled. Some pointed to St. Leger. Had the diplomat used arsenic instead of artillery? Others pointed to the survivors of the Geraldine faction. No one was ever charged. The death of the Earl of Ormond decapitated the Butler family just as effectively as the executioner had decapitated Leonard Grey. The message was clear. The curse of Ireland was indiscriminate. It killed the soldiers, it killed the rebels, and it killed the loyalists. The O'Neills were indeed rising, but the England they faced was changing. As the great Henry VIII breathed his last, the certainty of the Tudor state died with him. The crown passed to a sickly boy, and the policy of Ireland drifted into a dangerous limbo. The days of diplomatic bribery were ending. A colder, harder philosophy was taking root in London. It was no longer enough to govern the Irish. The new regime began to wonder if it was possible to simply replace them. The era of the general was over. The era of the settler was about to begin. We left the narrative at the death of Henry VIII in 1547. The Colossus was gone, and with him died the terrifying certainty of the Tudor state. What followed was a period often described by historians as the mid-Tudor crisis, a decade of short reigns, religious whiplash, and administrative chaos. Lord Leonard Grey was dead, buried under the flagstones of the Tower. But the questions he had tried to answer with gunpowder remained. How does a small island, England, govern a neighboring island, Ireland, that does not wish to be governed? The failure of Grey's sword and the eventual collapse of St. Leger's treaties left the crown with a stark realization. Neither total war nor total bribery had produced lasting peace. Now, as the mid-century approached, London turned to a third, far more radical option. It was a strategy darker and more permanent than anything Leonard Grey had ever attempted. The goal was no longer to merely kill rebels. It was to erase them from the map entirely. This is the story of the first plantations, the moment the English decided that if they couldn't rule the Irish, they would replace them. When 9-year-old Edward VI ascended the throne in 1547, the government in London fell into the hands of the Duke of Somerset. Somerset was a soldier, but more importantly, he was a zealous Protestant. To the Gaelic Irish, the religious changes of Henry VIII had been confusing but manageable. Henry had broken with the Pope. but he had kept the Mass and the rituals. Edward's government, however, wanted to strip the altars. They sent soldiers into the churches of the Pale to whitewash the frescoes and smash the statues. This triggered a profound shift. Until this moment, the conflict in Ireland had been ethnic and political, English versus Irish. Now it became sectarian, Protestant versus Catholic. The Old English of the Pale, families like the Fitzgeralds and the Butlers, were culturally English, but they were devoutly Catholic. Suddenly they found themselves alienated from the very crown they served. The government in Dublin was no longer just a foreign power, it was a heretical power. Into this volatile mix stepped a new Lord Deputy, Sir Edward Bellingham. Bellingham was a man cut from the same cloth as Leonard Grey. He was a veteran soldier who believed that St. Leger's diplomacy was weakness. He arrived in 1548 with a new mandate: crush the resistance, build forts, and force the new religion on the people. Bellingham studied Grey's campaigns. He saw that Grey's mistake was marching into a territory, winning a battle, and then leaving. Bellingham decided to stay. He began building a network of permanent garrisons in the Midlands. He was laying the groundwork for a new kind of occupation. The territories of Leix and Offaly lay just to the west of the Pale. They were the ancestral lands of the O'More and O'Connor clans. These clans had raided the English settlements for centuries. Leonard Grey had fought them. St. Leger had tried to bribe them. In 1556, under the reign of Queen Mary I, who succeeded Edward, the crown finally lost patience. They passed an Act of Parliament that legally confiscated the lands of the O'Mores and O'Connors. This was revolutionary. Previous conquests had demanded submission. This conquest demanded the land itself. The government renamed Leix Queen's County and Offaly King's County. They established two new English towns, Maryborough, now Port-Louis, and Philipstown, now Dangeen. But here is the crucial innovation. They invited English settlers to move in. This was the first plantation. The goal was to physically replace the wild Irish population with civil English farmers. It was ethnic engineering. The O'Mores and O'Connors did not vanish. They retreated into the bogs and forests, waging a desperate guerrilla war that lasted for decades. They became woodkerns, shadowy fighters who burned the new settler farms by night. The violence was intimate and horrific. Leonard Grey's wars had been battles of armies. The plantation wars were battles of neighbors. It was a cycle of atrocity and counter-atrocity that would bleed the Midlands dry for 40 years. While the Midlands burned, a ghost walked back onto the stage. Gerald Fitzgerald, the boy whose escape had cost Leonard Grey his head, returned to England in 1554. He was now a man of 29. He had seen the courts of Florence and Paris. He was sophisticated, educated, and thanks to Queen Mary's Catholic sympathies, restored to favor. He was given back his title, the 11th Earl of Kildare. It seemed like a restoration. The people of the Pale lit bonfires. The wizard Earl, as he would later be known for his interest in alchemy, was back. But the Ireland he returned to had changed. The power of the feudal lords was broken. The English administration in Dublin Castle was now a bureaucratic machine run by professional English civil servants, not Anglo-Irish aristocrats. The Earl realized quickly that he could not be a king like his ancestors. He had to be a landlord and a politician. The fire of the Silken Thomas Rebellion was gone. The House of Kildare survived, but it had been tamed. Leonard Grey had failed to kill the boy, but time and politics had killed the threat the boy represented. However, just as the threat of the Kildares faded, a new, far more dangerous threat emerged in the north. In Ulster, The O'Neill dynasty was tearing itself apart. Con Bacach O'Neill, the old chieftain, had accepted St. Leger's deal. He had become the Earl of Tyrone. In doing so, he had agreed that his title would pass to his eldest, legitimate son, Matthew. But Irish law did not care about legitimacy in the English sense. It cared about strength. And Con had another son, a younger son named Shane. Shane O'Neill was a force of nature. He was charismatic, violent, and utterly fearless. He looked at his father's English earldom and laughed. He famously declared that he did not care to be an earl, for my ancestors were kings of Ulster. Shane represented the violent rejection of everything Leonard Grey and St. Leger had tried to achieve. He rejected English law. He rejected English dress. He rejected the English crown. He saw his brother Matthew not as a brother, but as an English puppet. In 1558, Shane's men ambushed and killed Matthew. By the rules of Dublin Castle, Shane was a murderer and a usurper. By the rules of Ulster, he was the strongest man, and therefore the rightful king. Shane was inaugurated as the O'Neill in the ancient pagan style on the stone at Tullagoge. He threw down the gauntlet to the new queen, who ascended the English throne in 1558, Elizabeth I. The conflict between Elizabeth I and Shane O'Neill is one of the great dramas of history. Elizabeth was cautious, parsimonious, and Machiavellian. Shane was bombastic, unpredictable, and lethal. Elizabeth sent army after army to bring Shane to heel. They all failed. Shane used the terrain just as the rebels of Grey's time had, but he had refined the tactics. He was a master of mobile warfare. He refused to give the English a standing target. When they marched north, he vanished. When they turned back, he attacked their rear. Desperate, Elizabeth invited Shane to London for peace talks in 1562. It was one of the most surreal scenes of the Tudor era. Shane O'Neill marched into the court of Elizabeth I, flanked by his gallows warriors, giant mercenaries armed with 6-foot battle axes, bareheaded and long-haired. The polished courtiers of London stared in horror and fascination. Shane knelt to Elizabeth, confessed his sins in Irish, which she didn't understand, and then proceeded to charm her. He argued that he was actually a loyal subject, and that he had only killed his brother because his brother was a bad man. Elizabeth, knowing she couldn't afford a war, let him go. She recognized him as the captain of Tyrone. It was a humiliation for the English administration. Shane returned to Ulster as a victor. He ruled the north like a despot. He raided his neighbors, he defied Dublin, and he mocked the English generals. Why is Shane O'Neill relevant to the story of Leonard Grey? Because Shane was the nightmare that Grey had predicted. Grey had argued 20 years earlier that half measures would not work. He had argued that unless the Irish military caste was broken completely, they would always rise again. Grey had been executed for being too brutal. Now the English government wished they had a Leonard Grey. The failure to deal with Shane O'Neill proved that diplomacy without force was useless. The crown began to circle back to the methods of 1540. A new generation of English commanders was rising. Men like Henry Sidney. Sidney had read the reports, he knew the history. He realized that to defeat Shane, he had to be more ruthless than Shane. In 1566, Sidney launched a massive campaign. He didn't just march, he garrisoned. He used the Navy to land troops behind Shane's lines. He bribed Shane's neighbors, the O'Donnells, to attack him from the west. It was Leonard Grey's strategy, but perfected. It was total war. Shane O'Neill was not defeated by the English army. He was defeated by his own hubris, squeezed by Sidney's forces and the O'Donnells. Shane made a fatal error. He sought refuge with the MacDonalds of Antrim, Scots mercenaries whom he had previously attacked. On June 2, 1567, at a feast in Cushendun, the tension boiled over. The MacDonalds drew their daggers. Shane O'Neill, the King of Ulster, was hacked to pieces. His head was cut off. The Scots, eager for the reward, pickled the head in a barrel of salmon and sent it to Dublin Castle. The Lord Deputy, Henry Sidney, took the head and impaled it on a spike above the gates of Dublin Castle. It remained there for years, a grinning skull staring down at the city. Shane's death marked the end of an era. The Gaelic revival was checked, but the cost had been astronomical, and the violence of the O'Neill Wars had radicalized a new generation of English administrators. Men like Edmund Spencer and Walter Raleigh were arriving in Ireland. They did not see a kingdom to be governed. They saw a savage wilderness to be tamed. They looked at the Irish not as subjects, but as obstacles. The ghost of Leonard Gray watched from the battlements. The policy of pardon was gone. The age of extermination was approaching. The stage was set for apocalypse, but the curtain would be raised by a new cast of characters. The men who had killed Shane O'Neill were merely the vanguard. Now, as the 1570s dawned, the New English arrived, men who looked at the Irish map and saw not a kingdom, but a blank canvas for their own ambitions. The violence of the past decades would soon look like mere skirmishes compared to the systematic devastation that was coming. The fire was no longer just burning on the borders. It was about to consume the very heart of the South. We enter the 1570s, a decade where the skies over Ireland turned permanently gray with smoke. The execution of Lord Leonard Gray in 1541 had been a shock. The killing of Shane O'Neill in 1567 had been a triumph. But these were merely the prologue to the true horror. The Tudor conquest was about to shift gears from pacification to colonization. A new breed of Englishmen was stepping off the boats in Dublin. These men were not like Leonard Gray. Gray had been a medieval aristocrat who saw the Irish as disobedient subjects. The new men, Sir Humphrey Gilbert, Sir Henry Sidney, and later Walter Raleigh, were Renaissance adventurers. They had read the Roman classics. They viewed themselves as civilized Romans, taming the barbarian Gauls. They did not want to govern the Irish. They wanted to replace them. And in a twist of supreme irony, the family that had destroyed Leonard Gray, the loyal, powerful Butlers, would find themselves caught in the very trap they had helped to build. To understand the chaos of 1569, we must look at the Butler family. For centuries, the Earls of Ormond had been the crown's rock in Ireland. They were the Old English, culturally English, loyal to London, but Catholic and deeply embedded in Irish land law. They had brought down Leonard Gray because he threatened their power. They thought they had won. But the New English officials arriving in Dublin didn't care about the Butlers' loyalty. They only saw their land. An English adventurer named Sir Peter Carew arrived in Dublin claiming that based on dusty documents from the 12th century, he owned vast swathes of land in Leinster, land that belonged to the Butlers' allies. In a shocking ruling, the Dublin government sided with Carew. The Butlers were stunned. They realized the rules had changed. Their loyalty would not protect their property. In 1569, the unthinkable happened. The Butlers rose in revolt. The brothers of the Earl of Ormond, led by Edward Butler, attacked the English settlements. These were the men who had cheered Leonard Gray's execution. Now they were burning the king's towns. It proved a fundamental truth. The Tudor state was an insatiable machine. It would eat its enemies first, but eventually it would eat its friends. While the Butlers rioted in Leinster, a far more dangerous fire was lit in Munster. This was the First Desmond Rebellion. The leader was James Fitzmaurice Fitzgerald, a cousin of the Earl of Desmond. He was a man of immense charisma and deep religious conviction. He saw clearly what was happening. The English were not just taking land, they were destroying the Catholic faith. Fitzmaurice did something new. He didn't just call on his clan, he called on the Pope and the King of Spain. He turned an Irish land dispute into a European holy war. The Crown's response was immediate and terrifying. They sent Sir Humphrey Gilbert to Munster. If Leonard Grey was a hammer, Humphrey Gilbert was a guillotine. Gilbert believed that the Irish were not entitled to the laws of war. He wrote, "Through terror, the short war is the best war." Gilbert's tactics were psychologically scarring. When he captured a castle, he killed everyone, but he didn't stop there. At the end of the day, he would order the heads of the dead to be cut off. He would then line the path to his tent with these severed heads. When the Irish chieftains came to surrender or negotiate, they had to walk through a corridor of their dead kinsmen's heads to reach Gilbert. It worked. The terror broke the rebellion. James Fitzmaurice surrendered in 1573, but the cost was the total alienation of the population. The New English had proven they were capable of atrocities that made the Maynooth pardon look like a misdemeanor. History has a strange sense of rhythm. Just as the wounds of the 1570s were beginning to scab over, the name Grey returned to haunt Ireland. In 1580, the Second Desmond Rebellion was raging. This time, the stakes were existential. A papal force, Italian and Spanish soldiers sent by the Vatican, had landed at Smerwick in Kerry. They built a fort called Dún an Oyer, the Fort of Gold. To face this international threat, Queen Elizabeth sent a new Lord Deputy, Arthur Grey, the 14th Baron Grey, to Wilton. He was not Leonard Grey's son, but he was a distant relative, carrying the same ancient name and the same hard-edged Protestant military ethos. He arrived with a secretary named Edmund Spencer, who would later write The Faerie Queen, and a young captain named Walter Raleigh. Lord Arthur Grey marched to Smerwick in November 1580. The situation was eerily similar to Maynooth in 1535. A foreign garrison was holding a fort against a Grey. The siege of Smerwick lasted only a few days. The English artillery, just like at Maynooth, pounded the walls. The Italian commander Bastiano di San Giuseppe realized he could not hold out. He surrendered. He believed, as the garrison at Maynooth had believed, that he would be treated with the honors of war. These were professional soldiers sent by the Pope. Surely they would be ransomed. Lord Arthur Grey was clear in his report to the Queen. He told the commander that they were not soldiers. They were bandits, with no commission from a lawful king. On the morning of November 10th, 1580, the surrender was accepted. The English troops entered the fort. They disarmed the Italians and Spaniards. Then, at a signal, the slaughter began. Walter Raleigh and his men moved through the ranks, systematically butchering over 600 unarmed prisoners. They were stabbed, beheaded, and thrown over the cliffs into the sea. The sand at Smerwick ran red. Arthur Grey spared only the officers, whom he could ransom. The rest were annihilated. Queen Elizabeth wrote to Grey thanking him for his greatly executed service. The curse of the Greys had struck again. Another Lord Grey, another surrendered garrison, another massacre. It reinforced the message to the Irish: there is no law for you. There is only death. Arthur Grey was eventually recalled, much like Leonard Grey, amidst complaints about the cost of his wars, but he left behind a Munster that was being systematically destroyed. The English commanders realized that they could not catch the rebels in the vast forests of Munster. So they decided to kill the forest itself. They launched a scorched earth policy. They burned the crops. They slaughtered the herds of cattle. They destroyed the grain stores. The result was a famine of biblical proportions. Edmund Spencer, observing the aftermath, wrote one of the most chilling passages in English literature. Out of every corner of the wood and glens they came creeping forth upon their hands, for their legs could not bear them. They looked like anatomies of death. They spake like ghosts crying out of their graves. In a short space there were none almost left. and a most populous and plentiful country suddenly left void of man or beast. This was the legacy of the military solution. It wasn't just victory, it was extermination. The House of Desmond, one of the oldest and most powerful dynasties in Europe, was wiped out. Their lands, 500,000 acres, were confiscated. With the people dead or starving, the land was empty. The crown declared the province of Munster open for business. This was the plantation of Munster. The land was carved up into massive estates and given to undertakers, English gentlemen who undertook to import English tenants to farm the land. Walter Raleigh got 40,000 acres in Youghal. Edmund Spenser got 3,000 acres at Kilcolman Castle, where he wrote his poetry on the desk of a dead Irish lord. It was a massive attempt to turn Ireland into a mirror of southern England. They planned for orderly villages, Protestant churches, and cider orchards, but they were building on a graveyard. The surviving Irish retreated into the hills, watching the new settlers with eyes burning with hunger and hatred. They were waiting. The South lay in ruins, a graveyard of famine and fire. To the English eye, the conquest looked complete, but silence is not always submission. In the deep woods of the north, the lesson of the Desmonds had been learned. Hugh O'Neill had watched the tragedy of the South and decided that he would not be a victim. He would be a student. While Dublin celebrated its victory, the Fox of Ulster was quietly building a machine of war that would bring the Tudor state to the very brink of collapse. The final act was not a mop-up operation, it was a fight for survival. As the 16th century entered its final decade, the Tudor conquest of Ireland seemed complete. The South was broken, the Midlands were planted, and the West was cowed. In Dublin Castle, the administrators breathed a sigh of relief. They believed the Irish question had finally been answered with fire and sword, but they had forgotten the North. Ulster remained the last bastion of the Gaelic world, a fortress of forests, lakes, and ancient laws that had repelled English armies for centuries. And in the heart of Ulster sat a man who was the most dangerous enemy the English crown would ever face. He was not a wild rebel like Shane O'Neill. He was a polished courtier who wore English velvet, spoke perfect English, and knew the mind of Queen Elizabeth better than her own generals. His name was Hugh O'Neill, and he was about to prove that the ghost of Leonard Grey, the fear of a competent, modernized enemy, was real. Hugh O'Neill, the second Earl of Tyrone, was a paradox. As a boy, he had been a ward of the crown, raised in the English Pale, and educated in the households of English nobles. He had fought for the Queen against the Desmond rebels. He had ridden alongside the English cavalry. To the government in London, he was their greatest success story, a civilized Gael, a man they could trust to police the North. But Hugh was playing a long game. He was a master of holding and hiding. For years, while professing loyalty to the Queen, he was secretly building a modern army. He exploited a loophole in the law. He asked the crown for permission to train 600 men to keep the peace in Ulster. The crown agreed. Hugh trained them, then sent them home and recruited 600 more. Then another 600. Over a decade, he rotated thousands of Ulster clansmen through professional military training. He imported lead for roofing his castle and melted it down into bullets. He bought muskets from Scotland. He didn't build a rabble. He built a disciplined, gunpowder-armed fighting force that could match the English in the open field. He was the Fox of Ulster, smiling at the sheriff while sharpening the knife. The peace broke in 1594. It wasn't a sudden explosion, but a calculated escalation. Hugh O'Neill formed an unprecedented alliance. He united with his historic rival, Red Hugh O'Donnell of Tyrconnell. The O'Neills and O'Donnells had fought each other for centuries, but Hugh realized that if they didn't stand together, they would hang separately. This alliance, the Ulster Confederacy, was the nightmare scenario Leonard Grey had warned of 60 years prior. When the English sent armies north to quell the disturbances, they were shocked. They weren't facing kerns throwing stones. They were facing lines of musketeers who fired in volleys. They were facing caliver men who used trench warfare. At the Battle of Clontibret in 1595, O'Neill ambushed the English column. The English commander, Sir Henry Bagenal, O'Neill's brother-in-law and bitter enemy, barely escaped. It was a humiliation. The English realized too late they had trained their own destroyer. The turning point of the entire Tudor conquest came on August 14, 1598. Sir Henry Bagenal marched a massive army of 4,000 men north to relieve a besieged fort on the Blackwater River. He was confident. He represented the might of the state. O'Neill was waiting for him at a place called the Yellow Ford. It was a masterclass in guerrilla warfare, adapted for large armies. O'Neill had dug trenches and earthworks across the road, a tactic known as a plashing. He forced the English into a narrow kill zone bordered by bog and forest. As the English column struggled through the mud, O'Neill's musketeers opened fire from the trees. Then the Irish pikemen charged. It was a slaughter. Bagenal was shot in the head and killed instantly. The English army disintegrated. Over 800 English soldiers were killed, and the rest scattered. The Irish captured all the artillery and supplies. The Battle of the Yellow Ford was the greatest victory ever won by Irish arms against the English state. Panic swept through London. This was no longer a police action. The Irish had destroyed a royal army. The rebellion exploded across the entire island. In Munster, the plantation collapsed overnight. The English settlers, who had taken the lands of the Desmonds, were chased out, stripped naked, or killed. The work of 50 years was undone in a week. Queen Elizabeth was old, furious, and terrified. She needed a savior. She turned to her favorite, Robert Devereux, the second Earl of Essex. He was the most glamorous man in England, dashing, popular, and arrogant. He promised the Queen he would bring her the head of Hugh O'Neill. In 1599, Essex arrived in Dublin with the largest army ever sent to Ireland, 16,000 infantry and 1,300 cavalry. It was an armada on land. But Essex suffered from the same disease that had afflicted Leonard Grey. He underestimated the country. Instead of marching straight at O'Neill in Ulster, Essex wasted his time and his men on pointless parades through Munster. He chased shadows. His soldiers died of dysentery and typhoid. By the time he turned north to face O'Neill, his grand army was a shivering wreck. When Essex finally met O'Neill, he didn't fight. He parleyed. The two men met alone at a ford in the river. No one knows exactly what was said, but they agreed to a truce. Elizabeth was apoplectic. She had paid for a conquest, not a conversation. Essex, realizing he had lost the Queen's favor, panicked. He abandoned his post in Ireland and rushed back to London to explain himself, an act of desertion that would eventually lead to his execution for treason. The parallels with Leonard Grey are haunting. Both men were favorites. Both were sent to crush a rebellion. Both found the task impossible, and both died by the axe after failing to satisfy a demanding monarch. With Essex gone, the Queen played her final card. She sent Charles Blount, Lord Mountjoy. Mountjoy was different. He was not a dashing cavalier. He was a cold, calculating intellectual. He was a student of war who did not care about glory, only results. He realized that he could not defeat O'Neill in battle. O'Neill was too good. So Mountjoy decided to defeat the Irish people. He instituted a policy of total starvation. He ordered his troops to burn every field of corn, kill every cow, and smash every plow in Ulster. He planted garrisons everywhere, choking O'Neill's supply lines. He wrote to London, "I have made a great destruction of the people by famine." It was a war of attrition. O'Neill watched his people starve. He watched his allies surrender one by one. He needed a miracle. The miracle arrived in September 1601. A Spanish fleet landed at Kinsale, on the southern coast of Cork. It was the intervention O'Neill had prayed for. But it was a strategic nightmare. The Spanish had landed at the wrong end of the country. Ulster is in the extreme north. Kinsale is in the extreme south. To join his allies, O'Neill and Red Hugh O'Donnell had to march their armies the entire length of Ireland in the depths of winter through enemy territory. It was a legendary march. They evaded Mountjoy's patrols, covering hundreds of miles over frozen mountains. They arrived at Kinsale in December 1601, trapping Mountjoy's army between the Irish forces and the Spanish inside the town. The English were surrounded. They were starving and dying of disease. All O'Neill had to do was wait. If he held his position, Mountjoy's army would rot away. But the Spanish commander pressed O'Neill to attack. Red Hugh O'Donnell, impetuous and fiery, agreed. O'Neill, the cautious tactician, advised against it, but was overruled. On the morning of Christmas Eve 1601, the Irish launched a dawn attack. It was a catastrophe. The coordination was poor. The surprise was lost. Mountjoy's cavalry caught the Irish infantry in the open. The modernized Irish army, which had never been defeated, panicked and broke. In 1 hour, the war was lost. The Battle of Kinsale was the death knell of Gaelic Ireland. The aftermath was a slow, painful funeral. Red Hugh O'Donnell fled to Spain to beg for more troops, where he was likely poisoned by an English agent. He died in Valladolid, far from the hills of Donegal. Hugh O'Neill retreated to Ulster, fighting a desperate rearguard action. But Mountjoy's noose was tightening. The famine was absolute. The chronicles say the roads were lined with the unburied dead, their mouths green from eating nettles and grass. In March 1603, O'Neill surrendered. He met Mountjoy at Mellifont Abbey. The great O'Neill, the descendant of high kings, knelt before the English Lord Deputy. He renounced his title of the O'Neill. He swore loyalty to the crown. But there was a final bitter twist. As O'Neill knelt, Mountjoy had a secret in his pocket. Queen Elizabeth I had died in London 6 days earlier. Had O'Neill held out for just one more week, the English government might have collapsed in the transition of power. He might have secured better terms. Mountjoy kept the news secret until the ink on the treaty was dry. O'Neill surrendered to a corpse. The war was over, but the peace was unbearable. The English officials in Dublin harassed O'Neill constantly, using the law to chip away at his lands and his religion. They wanted him dead or gone. In September 1607, Hugh O'Neill made a fateful decision. He realized there was no place for him in the New Ireland. On a gray morning in Rathmullen, Donegal, O'Neill, and the remnants of the northern nobility boarded a French ship. They sailed for the continent, hoping to return with an army. They never did. This event is known as the Flight of the Earls. It was the final decapitation of the Gaelic order. The chiefs left, and they left their people behind. The English crown declared their lands, vast millions of acres in Ulster, forfeit. This paved the way for the plantation of Ulster, the mass immigration of Scottish Presbyterians and English Protestants that would create the sectarian divide that defines Northern Ireland to this day. The story that began with Leonard Grey marching on Maynooth in 1535 ends with Hugh O'Neill sailing away in 1607. It was a century of fire. The Tudor conquest transformed Ireland from a patchwork of feudal lordships into a centralized English colony. But the cost was incalculable. It was paid in the blood of the Geraldines, the starvation of Munster, the slaughter of Smerwick, and the exile of the O'Neills. Leonard Grey was the first casualty of this new world, a man who tried to serve a king who demanded the impossible. He taught the crown a lesson it never forgot, that Ireland could not be governed by half measures. It had to be broken before it could be built. As the ship carrying O'Neill disappeared over the horizon, the Gaelic sun set. But the night that followed would be long, dark, and full of ghosts.